Welcome to Neurodivergent Relationships with Dr. Kathy Marshak, the podcast where we explore the complex, beautiful, and sometimes heartbreaking world of neurodivergent relationships. I'm Dr. Kathy Marshak, your host. I'm a psychologist, author, and a lifelong advocate for understanding the unique challenges that come with neurodiverse and neurotypical partnerships. Today's episode is called When Love Turns to Power Plays: How Neurodivergent Couples Slide into Unethical Conduct. Abraham Lincoln once said, "Nearly all men can stand adversity, women too." He didn't say that, but if you want to test a man's character, give him power. So today's episode is about something we don't often talk about: how neurodivergent couples and families slide into the same unethical power plays that we see in corrupt leaders, abusers, and manipulators. We often think of unethical conduct as something other people do, people in power, politicians, con artists. But what if we do it too? What if in moments of pain, defensiveness, and self-preservation we fall into the very behaviors we resent in others? What if instead of working through pain, we start gaslighting, distorting reality, rewriting history, or punishing the very person we love? Power can be corrosive when used to control others rather than to master ourselves. This episode is not about how the world manipulates us. It's about how we manipulate each other when we feel threatened, dismissed, or powerless. And we're going to dig deep into real life examples, including my own experiences with my ex-husband's divorcing petition, my neighbor's HOA power struggles, and even how slander cut me off from my grandson, Jameson. So let's start with how neurodivergent couples fall into power games. One of them is the demand for a compromise when it's really only one-sided. Compromise is a word that gets thrown around a lot, but let's be honest, sometimes it's just coercion wearing a polite mask. One person is expected to bend completely while the other walks away unchanged. So let me give you an example of compromise with my neighbor David. David wanted me to top my trees, which I didn't want to do, and I didn't have an obligation to do so, and I had the right to refuse. But instead of demanding it outright, he presented it as a compromise. His offer: I'll even pay for half of the cost. Think about that. He was offering to partially pay for something I didn't want in the first place. That's not compromise. That's manipulation. In neurodivergent relationships, this same pattern shows up when an ASD partner assumes their way is the only logical choice. For example, they might say something like, "Just do it my way. It makes the most sense." Or an NT partner might pressure with emotions. "If you loved me, you'd be more affectionate." When compromise becomes one-sided, it's not fairness. It's about control. So here's another method: emotional dismissal, disguised as moving forward. When people don't want to deal with the damage they've caused, they rush to move on. But moving forward without accountability is just sweeping problems under the rug. How many times have you heard, "Gosh, why are you bringing that up again? That happened a long time ago." Maybe a week ago, maybe 2 years ago. But the person says to you, "It happened a long time ago. Can't we just move on?" when it really still hasn't been resolved. That's manipulation. I also had my neighbor did the same thing. David's wife, Vicky, was finally coming to terms with the fact that she and her husband had been mismanaging their stormwater runoff and piping it over to my backyard. When she was finally forced to face the truth, she was really bewildered. She had no idea she'd been causing considerable damage for years. When reality hit her, she didn't apologize. She didn't take responsibility or offer to fix the problem. Instead, she wanted to move on. She said, "I just want to move forward." That's not accountability. That's convenience. And I was supposed to carry the burden. Another tool is something called false equivalence, weaponizing a concept called two sides to every story. Not every conflict is equal. Sometimes one side is clearly in the wrong, but power plays make everything look mutual. I think you might agree with me that my neighbors were clearly in the wrong when they decided to pipe their stormwater runoff through a pipe into my backyard. So it was clearly wrong. But when I confronted David about this negligence, and even as the HOA president, he should know better and to take some responsibility, his response wasn't to address the actual problem. Instead, he shrugged and said, well, there are two sides to every story. This is classic false equivalence. It's a manipulation tactic to avoid accountability and to put the other person off so that they are a little bewildered by such a comment. Another tool that's used when we get kind of down and decide we're going to be into a power struggle is character assassination. That's weaponizing ASD logic and legal strategy. My ex-husband, Howard, is a skilled attorney and had the classic ASD preference for rules, order, and logic. When I divorced him, he did what made the most sense to him, not to our family, not to our children. He saw our divorce as a legal battle to be won rather than an emotional event to process. And in any legal proceeding, you are going to argue zealously for your position if you're an attorney. So he did. He rewrote history. He talked about everything that was wrong with me, wanted to make sure that the entire community knew that I was at fault for getting a divorce. And then there's what he did to our daughters. Howard actually petitioned the court to split up our children, treating them like property. Howard's transactional thinking didn't just affect me, it deeply impacted our daughters. One of his most calculated power plays during our divorce was asking the judge to split up our children. Why? Because if he only had one child, he could reduce his child support obligation. And he even wanted me to take the more difficult child. That's how he called it, Bianca, because she's autistic. This was the same Bianca whose special needs he denied in court, demanding that I prove that she's autistic and needed special ed and psychiatric care and so forth. But because children aren't chess pieces in a legal battle, he lost, thank goodness. But what a terrible thing to do to our family. What a terrible message to send to his children that they're just his property. So let me leave you with a final reflection. This is the story of Narcissus winning at the cost of everything. And you probably know the story of Narcissus. He's a man who fell in love with his own reflection in the cool, smooth pond. He spent his life gazing at his own image in the water, enchanted by the illusion of himself. But he could never truly possess that illusion. And in the end, he wasted away, dying alone by the pond, never having loved anything real or anyone. Howard spent years chasing the illusion of victory too, and in the end, he destroyed everything meaningful in his life, just so he could hold on to the image of himself as the winner. He wasn't the first to lose himself in his own reflection, and he won't be the last, because power, when used to control others instead of mastering oneself, becomes a slow poison. As Abraham Lincoln said, nearly all men can stand adversity, but if you want to test a man's character, give him power. Power reveals who we truly are. If you use it to control, you erode everything good around you. If you use it to elevate others, you build something lasting. Howard, David, and Vicky all failed that test, and they lost everything that really mattered. So here's a question to leave you with. Before you react in your next disagreement, before you push to be right, before you refuse to listen, ask yourself, is this true? And is this necessary? And is this kind? If it doesn't meet the test, try another approach. And don't mistake kindness for weakness, please. It can be kind to confront. It can be necessary, and it can be true. But it takes real courage to ask, is this true and necessary and kind for both of us? Because the only way out of this cycle is not to win, but to choose honesty over self-protection, connection over control, and radiant empathy over power. That's it for today's episode. If this conversation resonated you, I invite you to join the podcast after party. All you have to do is go to my website to find out when it's scheduled. It'll be a live video conference for our private members, And it will be recorded, so if you're a member of our group, you will be able to look at it and listen to it later. You can also explore my online courses at drkathylearningcenter.thinkific.com. Again, that's posted on my website. And if you found today's episode valuable, please subscribe, leave a review, and share this podcast with others. So, until next time, remember, empathy is more than words. It isn't just words, it's action. Take care.